My name is Daniel Mercer, and I'm 38 years old. I live in Seattle, in a high-rise apartment overlooking the water, the kind of view that makes you think you've made it, even when your life's foundation is quietly rotting underneath. I'm a systems analyst for a cybersecurity firm called Nexitech. Not glamorous, but it pays well enough to build a life. Or, at least, that's what I thought I was doing, building something steady, predictable, safe. For 7 years, I was with Claire. We met at a conference in San Francisco. She was working PR for a startup, all confidence and wine-glass laughter, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone listen. I was quieter back then. Still am, I suppose. She told me once that I made her feel grounded, that I was the still point in her chaos. It's funny how people romanticize the very things they end up resenting. For years, we were fine. Dinners at our favorite Italian place on Pine, lazy Sunday mornings spent watching reruns with takeout boxes on the coffee table. Even the fights, the small, human kind, always ended in laughter. I thought she was it, the one I could stop searching with. But if you've ever been betrayed, you know that the worst part isn't the discovery. It's the revision, the way your mind starts replaying every scene, every moment that once felt pure, and realizes how many lies were hiding between the words. It started with a scent, cologne, not mine. Something sharp, expensive, the kind you only smell on men who iron their shirts for pleasure. Claire came home late one evening, cheeks flushed, hair slightly undone, saying her client dinner had run long. She was apologetic, distracted, almost rehearsed. I remember kissing her cheek and tasting guilt, faint, metallic, like blood in the back of your throat. I told myself it was nothing. That's the first lie betrayed men tell themselves. But the pattern grew. Late meetings, muted phone calls from the balcony, laughter that stopped when I walked into the room. One night, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the counter. A name flashed across the screen, Ethan Cole. I knew the name, one of her colleagues from Blue Wave Media, the agency she'd joined last year. I'd met him once at a company party. Tall, perfectly polite, the kind of man who shakes your hand firmly, just to see if you'll flinch. The message preview was short. Ethan, still thinking about last night. Couldn't focus at all today. I remember the moment in full, brutal detail, the hum of the shower, the steam fogging the mirror, the way my reflection blurred as I stared at that screen. It wasn't shock, it was clarity, a terrible, crystalline clarity that sliced through every illusion I'd built around us. I didn't confront her right away. That's not who I am. I don't yell. I don't throw things. I observe. The next day, while she was at work, I opened my laptop and started digging. Ethan Cole, account director, Blue Wave Media, formerly Hanson and Low PR, married once, divorced 3 years ago. No kids, clean professional record. LinkedIn, Instagram, press mentions, all the usual footprints of a man who wants to be seen. Then I started watching her. Every evening, I made mental notes. Her schedule, her calls, her new perfume. The shifts in tone when she said his name casually. Whoa. Ethan said the client might extend the campaign. I installed a discreet sync app on our shared tablet, just to see her calendar entries. Client dinners, late review, strategy meeting, all with the same initials, EC. Within a week, the pattern wasn't suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. The night I knew for sure was a Thursday. She'd told me she'd be late. Client drinks at the W Hotel. I waited. Midnight came and went. At 12:43 a.m. she texted, "Don't wait up. Staying at the hotel? Too much wine. Love you, love you." 2 words that can mean everything or nothing, depending on the moment. I didn't reply. Instead, I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove. The W is only 15 minutes from our place. Downtown was empty, slick with rain. I parked across the street from the glass-lit lobby and waited. I didn't even know what I wanted to see. Maybe proof that would hurt enough to end it. At 1:17 a.m., they walked out, her hand on his chest. his arm around her waist. The kind of body language you don't fake. They laughed, shared a look, then kissed. Not a drunk, reckless kiss. A practiced one, familiar, intimate. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the leather creaked. The rain on the windshield made it all look cinematic, like a scene from a movie where you already know how it ends. They walked together toward his car, a silver Tesla, and disappeared inside. That was the moment I stopped being the still point. That was the moment I began constructing the version of myself that could do what needed to be done. Revenge isn't born in rage. It's born in silence. In the calm that follows the realization that you've been made a fool of, that someone looked you in the eye, smiled, and lied. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I went home, poured a drink, and opened my laptop. If Ethan Cole thought he could live 2 lives, one clean, one secret, he hadn't met a man who made a career out of finding what people wanted to hide. I started with his work server, then his private accounts, and slowly, piece by piece, I began to build the architecture of his downfall, not because I wanted to destroy him, but because I wanted to teach him, and her, what it feels like to lose everything you thought was untouchable. And I would, because I was done being the quiet one. There is a line you cross when curiosity turns into occupation. For me, it wasn't dramatic. No cinematic snapping of fingers, no sudden violence. It was a series of small, deliberate choices that felt at first like necessary housekeeping. I found that so long as each act could be rationalized as information gathering, my hands stayed steady. My job at Nexitech had trained me to think in layers. Systems don't break at the point of impact. They fail where weak protocols meet daily habit. People are the same. You don't need to burn a person down with a torch. You set a match to the things they take for granted: access, pride, reputation. The first thing I did was map Ethan Cole's life the way I would map an attack surface. Public footprint first, LinkedIn endorsements, speaking gigs, charity mentions. Then the private, the shallow scrape across social handles, cached pages, old event photos. He had the phony polish of someone who'd made a career of seeming kinder than he was. That arrogance is a vulnerability. It makes you sloppy in predictable ways. Next, the infrastructure he relied on. I knew how Blue Wave Media hosted campaign assets and where their vendors pushed creative files. I knew what sort of two-factor authentication some firms adopted as theater rather than security. Small firms like Blue Wave often relied on single-account logins for creative portals. People reused passwords across systems because deadlines are louder than caution. I didn't have to hack anything dramatic. I just used the quiet holes they already left open. I started where it would raise the least suspicion: shadow accounts, forgotten FTP servers, the personal Google Drive links people lobbed into Slack when they were tired. I wrote scripts that watched for file movements and photographed metadata. I set up alerts that pinged me whenever Ethan uploaded a deck or shared a vendor invoice. I didn't break encryption. I observed patterns. Observation, I'd learned, is itself a scalpel. Some nights I felt ridiculous, crouched behind my monitor. A man grown, middle-aged and precise, taking notes on the timestamp of an innocuous PDF. But the timestamps told stories. At 2:03 a.m. upload, a .docx last edited. At 12:40, a vendor invoice forwarded to a personal Gmail. Those tiny inconsistencies were the kind of things I'd spent years training myself to spot in logs and intrusion reports. Now they were the pattern of someone else's life. When I found the forwarded invoice, the one Sophie had sent to her Gmail with the note "hold until EC signs off," it was a clean little revelation. The vendor listed a bank account that routed to an LLC whose registration papers bore a signature that matched a name I'd seen as a shell contractor on other invoices. The money trails weren't dramatic at first: small retainer payments, consultancy fees that aggregated into a sum large enough to matter over a fiscal quarter. But financial systems are fractal. Small irregularities replicate into large ones when you follow them with patience. I began to assemble a dossier, not for some tabloid's amusement, for leverage. Photographs of Sophie and Ethan leaving the W Hotel went into an encrypted folder. Screenshots of their message threads, flirtatious, then casual, then normalized into language that suggested routine, were timestamped, cross-referenced, archived. I cataloged forwarded invoices, vendor names, routing numbers, and public filings for LLCs. I kept everything that showed a net, not just a kiss. But you can't win a field by shouting about mud. You win by nudging the air until people trip. So I calibrated pressure points. First, reputational nudges. A pattern of gentle, anonymous concern emails began circulating through places that notice reputations. A procurement manager who once worked with Blue Wave got a polite note asking for confirmation of vendor payment. James, we're doing pre-contract due diligence. It read bland and procedural. It did not name names, but procurement people are trained to be paranoid. The note made the client ask questions. When clients ask, vendors sweat. Second, social pressure. I fed a well-worded anonymous tip to a freelancer who owed a favor to a junior reporter. I didn't give him the smear. I gave him documents that read like a lead, vendor routing anomalies, copies of unpaid invoices, a chronology of transfers. Journalists respond to corroboration. They dislike emotional claims. They hunger for paper. I gave them paper, and they sharpened an angle. Third, personal leverage. I could have gone public with the hotel photo and the messages and ended it in a single, brutal broadcast. But that would be spectacle. I wanted them to feel a slow erosion. I wanted Sophie to sit through meetings where colleagues looked at her the way you look at a leaky pipe, concerned at first, then certain it will burst. So I leaked things selectively. An invoice here, a whisper there, a client query that privately asked about internal approval processes. The cascade took days, then weeks. All the while I kept the domestic show. I made coffee when she left at 6 in the morning. I fixed the slow kitchen tap. I laughed in the right places and asked about her day like a man who did not keep a ledger. It's astonishing how effective that pretense is. She never suspected I was the man who had planted the seed of doubt that would soon germinate at her office. There were ethical tests that came like small traps. I found myself tempted to plant forged documents. Imagine Ethan's face the morning he opens a doctored bank statement that lists him as the signatory on a shell LLC. But forging is a different crime, blunt and obvious, and would have exposed me. I resolved to avoid falsification. Everything I used had to be real, or at least a true copy of a thing someone else had produced. That distinction kept me sane in a way. It allowed me to believe I was delivering justice rather than practicing petty malice. Then the first crack opened. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Sophie called at lunch, voice clipped. "They want to see my files," he said. Someone flagged an invoice. Each emailed the whole team about compliance. Her panic leaked through her words like steam through a seam. I kept my voice level. "Which invoice?" "The Grayson one." Don't you know I didn't set up anything? I forwarded it. I didn't know it was a shell." Forwarded emails are small confessions. People do them out of habit. They forward without thinking. When forwarded emails become evidence, it's often because people are careless, not malicious. That carelessness is a vector. The firm pulled in legal. They sent Sophie a formal request for documentation. They scheduled a review meeting. One meeting turns into two. Two meetings turn into an audit. Audits unearth more anomalies. The machine eats its own oil. I let the machine go. I watched as Ethan grew louder, the way men do when they feel accused. He posted a firm statement on LinkedIn about integrity and deadlines, and his practiced smile in the press photo became brittle under scrutiny. People who once admired his charm began to whisper about his leadership judgment. The reporter, who had first sniffed the trail, called me. He was careful, professional. "Do you have anything that ties these invoices to internal approvals?" he asked. I could have walked away then. I could have handed him nothing and let corporate HR eat its own. But I wanted more than a single career scar. I wanted the humiliation of accountability, which is different. Accountability is public, it is reputational, and it makes people uncomfortable in every meeting afterward. So I gave him a chain of custody, emails, forwarded attachments, the LLC registration. I emphasized patterns, not passion. He ran a careful piece, vendor irregularities at Blue Wave Media. No mention of Sophie and Ethan yet. Enough to make procurement managers nervous. Enough to get legal teams to start looking in darker corners. As the pressure rose, the personal started to fray. Sophie became frightened in a new way. Less about dishonor than about calculation. She began to ask questions I couldn't answer without revealing the gun in my hand. One night, in the fragile light of our kitchen, she half accused me. "You don't look at me like you used to," she said, voice small. I measured my words. "I look at you like someone I love," I said. "I also look at the things you hide." She recoiled as if struck. "Why are you doing this? Who are you talking to?" I wanted to tell her everything, but confession gives space to spin a plausible defense. If she had to be cornered, it had to be her choices that splayed in the light, not my theatrics. So I lied by omission. "I'm worried. That's all," I said. "I've been worried." She left for the office the next morning with a clutch of documents in her bag. She kissed my forehead with a thin smile. That kiss tasted like an ending and a dare. The audit widened into something bigger when Blue Wave's largest client halted a campaign pending internal review. The procurement officer, a meticulous woman named Allison Reed, called for their own vendor audit after reading the industry piece. A hold like that sends shockwaves up a company's chain of command. Boards notice when revenue projects stall. Investors lean in. People with vested interests show their teeth. It was at this point, in the hum of pressure and boardroom posturing, that the case mutated from an office scandal into a systemic problem. The ledger trails I'd followed began to thread into larger networks. Micropayments consolidated into bigger transfers. Consultancy payments that matched donation records at a small political fund, and an account that reappeared across filings with an inscrutable name, Hillsborough Holdings. The account's routing had touched project budgets for pharma clients, deep, potentially toxic exposure. If it connected back to a name with clout, this would stop being a PR problem and start being a criminal one. That's when David Effen's boss, the kind of man who wears politeness like armor, called me out of the blue. He sounded flustered. "Daniel, are you hearing anything about this?" he asked. He shouldn't have had my number. I hadn't given it. I'd never met him. The link was odd and dangerous. I answered calmly. "Some industry chatter. Nothing confirmed." He didn't press. Men like him reflexively protect their own unless their options are very few. I filed the call away as noise and returned to tracing the patterns that mattered. One night, 2 months after the hotel emails leaked in a way I hadn't engineered, a contractor uploaded a batch of invoices to a public forum out of frustration and paid sums, dates, amounts. Within hours, screenshots of the thread hit journalists' inboxes. Someone, somewhere, had decided to make their grievance a blade. The timing was peculiar. The uploader's username matched a small subcontractor I'd spoken to weeks before. He claimed he'd never been paid. I didn't push the motive back then. People rage, people act. But the leak was useful. The firm was no longer just nervous. It was wounded. HR scheduled meetings. Ethical committees convened. In the corridors, people spoke in shorter sentences. Sophie's inbox swelled with requests for notes and approvals. She spent nights drafting explanations that sounded thinner with each send. And yet, in the center of this perfect pressure, something dark and unexpected happened. I began to feel ugly pleasure. Not the theatrical, triumphant kind you imagine in movies, more a low, steady satisfaction that comes from watching a wrong get measured and accounted. It is the same satisfaction auditors have when a ledger balances. I told myself it was righteous. I told myself it was about accountability. I told myself a lot of things because human beings need stories to survive the choices they make. The trick, I learned, was to avoid the grand reveal. The cinematic footage of betrayal is satisfying for a weekend, then it fades. The slow erosion leaves bruises you cannot bandage. So, I kept pulling threads. A vendor who said he'd been asked to route payments through Hillsborough. A junior account exec who forwarded an internal calendar that showed Athens late nights clustered around milestones where vendor payouts occurred. Each revelation was a small fissure, taken alone harmless. Together, a fault line. The Bureau, the sort that handles fraud and financial misdirection, took interest when a large client threatened litigation. Once a government body points a company, the machinery accelerates. Subpoenas were mentioned. Internal counsel vetted their statements carefully. Blue Wave issued a press release about cooperation and compliance. Their PR team, ironically, the same world Sophie inhabited, wrote hollow sentences meant to sound reassuring. They were too late. On a cold Friday morning, the Bureau sent a polite, legal letter requesting documents. Bracken and Heath's legal team pushed back, then complied. The audit began in earnest. Sophie called me that afternoon voice thing. They asked for my laptop, she said. They want everything. Give them everything, I said. It was the only honest answer I permitted myself. Cooperate. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think we can fix this? She asked, like someone trying to buy a life with an apology. I wanted to tell her the truth, that some things can't be fixed after they've been measured in public. But honesty would have ruined the instrument I was wielding. So I said instead, maybe we can make them understand. She sounded relieved and fragile, and for a second I felt pity. Then the pity hardened into resolve. I had to be careful now more than ever. Once the Bureau had their subpoenas, the chances of my actions being reverse-engineered increased. People lie for their freedom. Investigations, mercifully, do not forget that motive colors action. I moved my assets, not money, information. I encrypted, duplicated, and distributed. I put copies of key files in cloud accounts with false names. I ceded a few documents to the journalist I trusted, an insurance policy in case the legal channels were bought and bartered away. Visibility, I'd concluded, is a kind of protection. Make the story public enough, and it becomes harder to smother. That was the calculus I'd decided on late that rain-slick night. And then the first direct message came. No smoke screen, no anonymous tip. A simple, unadorned note slid onto my phone. We know what you've done. Stop, or worse things happen. And then the letter felt like an accusation and a promise. A single initial can be a threat when the person on the other end is powerful enough to make it matter. I did not reply. 2 days later, the ledger trace I'd been following revealed something I hadn't foreseen. The so-called Hillsborough Holdings account linked, through a web of small transfers, back to a donor list that included a name with local clout, a benefactor who sat on the boards of half a dozen civic institutions, whose handshake at a gala could open doors. Mason Keene, the name read, wealthy, protective, dangerous. The scale of things I'd touched shifted in my head like a map redrawn. This was no longer a private cross to bear. It was a public wire I'd clipped, and the current had surged into a city grid I'd not intended to ignite. When Sophie finally handed over her laptop to the auditors, I watched the process through a window of my own making. She stood there, small and professional, as her files were imaged and hashed. I felt something like grief for us, for the version of life that had once been ordinary and trusting. But grief, too, was a luxury. There was work to be done. At night I sat with a cup of coffee gone cold and scrolled through lines of metadata the way other men scroll through memories. The photographs of the kiss at the W Hotel sat in a folder labeled Evidence. The invoices sat in paper trail. The messages sat in correspondence. I had become an archivist of ruin, cataloging other people's missteps as if they were archaeological finds. And in that terrible craft I learned an essential truth. Revenge is an echo chamber. The choices you make to return pain ricochet back in unexpected ways. Walls that look solid enough to lean on sometimes collapse from the inside. Yet despite the danger, despite the text from him and the widening legal net, I felt certain of one thing: exposure would be the scalpel that saved me from being the fool again. If the network wasn't cut open, they'd stitch it up and let the sane men keep their privileges. If it was exposed, if Mason Keene's name appeared on the ledger, if the Bureau followed the thread through Hillsborough to a political donor list, then there would be no tidy cover-up left to negotiate. The weeks that followed were a tempo of steady escalation. The journalist published another piece with corroborated evidence. The Bureau widened their subpoena requests. Ethan's name became a sidebar in business coverage. Sophie's world narrowed to a few legal calls, and the way people looked at her in elevators. My nights shortened to operate on adrenaline and the cold comfort of METICULOUSNESS. And all the while, a single question reverberated at the back of my mind. Once the system responded, would the people who sat at the top of it reach down and break me to protect themselves? I did not know the answer yet, but I had learned how to listen for footsteps in server logs and hallways. I had learned how to make the world notice without being noticed. I had become, in ways I had never intended, the architect not only of their ruin but of my own survival. The blueprint was no longer only for collapse. It was also, quietly, a plan to withstand whatever came next. The part I most feared was no longer the exposure of Sophie and Ethan. It was the moment when the powerful, cornered and furious, decided that a quiet life in a high-rise had become an inconvenience they would not tolerate. And somewhere in the city, under the indifferent glow of office towers, someone with an initial as small as a letter M had already sent their first note. I closed my laptop, poured another coffee, and stared at the rain tracing lines down the window. The next move would matter. The next disclosure would ripple farther than I could predict. I had built the first half of the plan. Now I had to build protection for what came after. I turned out the lamp and, for the first time in months, felt the weight of consequence settle around my shoulders like an actual coat, heavy, cold, and oddly familiar. There's a peculiar cruelty to watching someone you love folded into the machinery of consequence. It's orderly and grotesque at once: meetings, memos, signatures, the polite language people use when they're gutting lives with paperwork. The human heart feels a world away from the sterile hum of office lights and legal pads. But that's where the damage settles. In the margins, in the small, steady erosion of everyday trust. After the Bureau issued subpoenas and the press ran the corroborated pieces, Blue Wave's internal counsel moved like a well-oiled machine. Damage control first, containment second, messaging third. They sent Sophie a formal interview request. They asked for her calendar, exports, her vendor approvals, and every message she'd ever forwarded. She handed them the laptop like someone surrendering a diary, and then stepped out of their life as if the world had turned an invisible key and locked her out. I was supposed to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt exposed, a man whose life had narrowed to folders and server snapshots, to the smell of soldered coffee and the clack of keys. I teared at the edges of my own conduct as investigators began to probe not only the firm but also the source of the leaks. Relevant or not, motive invites suspicion. It's a basic tilt of human systems. When you aim a lamp at a spot, shadows move elsewhere. Claire Jennings called me in for a formal interview at the Bureau. We sat in a small, windowless room that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old coffee. She carried a stack of printouts folded with the gentle cruelty of someone who knew how to make paper matter. I answered the questions with the same calm I used at work: accurate, measured, careful to avoid the poetic confessions that get people entangled. I told them what I had seen. I told them I'd followed breadcrumbs. I told them about the invoices and the routing numbers And the forwarded messages. I did not tell them everything. You learn to lie by omission when you've decided that some truths are tactical. I didn't tell Claire about the hotel photograph I'd taken and kept. I didn't tell her about the auto-forward rules I'd set on her tablet to log her calendar entries. I didn't tell her that at night I sometimes replayed the moment she kissed him as if it were a forensic loop, timing the inhale, the posture, the angle of his hand at her waist. Those intimate details were unnecessary for their legal calculus and dangerous for mine. If she later learned I had been so close, the Bureau would be right to ask what else I'd done. When I left the room, Claire thanked me and said, without warmth and with no need for false softness, "We'll be in touch," the phrase threaded like dental floss behind which evidence was packed, measured, and filed. Outside, the sky was a low, flat gray. The city seemed to hold its breath. I walked back to my car thinking less of the mechanics of the case and more of the brittle logic of human behavior. People will save themselves. People will point fingers if it means they keep their reputations intact. It was a useful truth and a dangerous one. The first major break came from an unexpected place. A junior vendor who had been stiffed for months finally decided she'd had enough. Her name was Mara Chen, and she'd been a subcontractor for Blue Wave on a small health outreach project. The ledger showed the same odd routing. In a fit of exasperation and maybe revenge, Mara uploaded a directory of invoices to a public contractor forum and posted a short, bitter note. I watched the thread blow up. Journalists that procurement officers noticed. The Bureau grew interested in the new detail. Things that had been quiet and technical acquired teeth. Mara's leak gave Claire the probable cause she needed to expand subpoenas. They requested banking records. The banks complied because the law compels banks to cooperate when the state asks. Patterns emerged. Transfers that once looked like small oddities moved into the light as deliberate consolidation. Payments broken into microsums, aggregated, and then shifted to an account with a name that matched public filings for Hillsborough Holdings, and, beyond that, a string of donations that read like a who's who of people who never liked being questioned. I watched each new paper arrive as if it were a blow shape tested by force. Mason Keene's name moved from rumor to notation, where before Keene had been a rumor in the margins of society pages and donor lists. He now became a note, a person investors called when markets jittered, and a philanthropist whose name opened doors on boards and in fundraising rooms that smelled permanently of expensive cheese. When his name surfaced in an internal memo, the way the world reacted changed. Phone calls got quieter. Messages were crafted with editor's care. Read meetings, board sessions with coffee and legal pads moved from crisis management to full legal posturing. The world that always made silent deals began to show its teeth. That's when the threats started to be obvious and direct. At first they were the anonymous things people send when they want to be frightening without risk. An unmarked envelope on my doormat with a photograph of my car the night I followed Sophie. A terse email from an address that had never existed in my contacts telling me, in a tone meant to be paternal and perilous, to stop. I saved each one. I documented them. They read like escalations in a chess game. Then came the phone call. No number, no preamble. A man's voice, smooth, indulgent, very calm. "Mr. Mercer, you've been a busy architect. Congratulations." There was a click, and then nothing. My pulse had the ridiculous habit of trying to outrun my thoughts. I called Claire. She listened, took notes, and told me to forward the message for the investigational record. Her voice remained procedural, which is something like merciful in moments when mercy could make things worse. "What do you think he meant?" I asked. "That someone with resources is watching," she said. "You're not the only person who's been telling stories to journalists. Some people prefer to handle things privately, but now your case is public. They'll test their options." The language was careful, but the meaning was obvious. The powerful will fight to survive. They could be surgical with money. They could be more brutal with reputations. They could threaten. They could also act in ways that never appear in courtrooms. Quiet phone calls, legal pressure, private investigators who press neighbors for plates and movements. I had assumed my knowledge of systems would be a shield. Instead, it had become a beacon. One night, weeks into the expanded investigation, I found someone waiting in my building lobby. He was a man in his 30s with expensive bone and a suit that suggested he moved in rooms where favors are currency. He introduced himself as a representative for a private security consultancy. Illegal, he claimed, retained by parties interested in the company. He asked to speak. I said no. He left a card anyway, thick, expensive, with a number and a name I didn't recognize. The card was a threat wrapped in civility. It had the dull blade of men who believe their money buys immunity. I started to take precautions. I moved encrypted copies of everything to redundant accounts I controlled under pseudonymous credentials. I told a journalist I trusted that if anything happened to me, the full dossier should go public immediately. We agreed on a deadman trigger word and a timestamp that would tell them to publish. Part of me felt shame at the performative melodrama of it. The other part felt like a man who understood leverage. David Langford's cooperation with Claire was a complicated thing. In exchange for leniency, the investigators wanted documentation, names, payments, timestamps. He gave them the ugly arithmetic of the network, and with each name he read off the map spread. He named shell companies, accountants who'd shrugged, and people who'd accepted comfort fees for looking away. Each confession shifted a weighted balance. A dozen lesser people were now on the stand of suspicion, and Mason Keene's name, when it landed with the force it finally had, made the room move like a tide. But the net was not only drawn for the big fish, it dragged in small fish too, contractors who had been paid in confusing ways, junior account managers who'd been promised bonuses, board members who'd been reassured, and thus complicit in their own ignorance. The Bureau's investigators filed motions. Lawyers squared off like gladiators in boardrooms. It was ugly and precise. Meanwhile, Sophie, having been dismissed by the firm and buffeted by press coverage, went quiet. I saw her twice in the weeks that followed. Once at a distance in a courthouse hallway, her face pale under fluorescent lights. Once at our old Italian place, where she sat across the table and asked, without accusation, "Why did you do this?" That was the single moment that cut deeper than any legal threat. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to list the nights I'd watched her, the shutdown of the trust I'd felt, the way her betrayal felt like a slow, deliberate theft. Instead, I said something honest and small, because you made me a stranger in my own life. She looked at me, and for a second the years we'd shared were illuminated not by guilt but by astonishment, surprise at the cost of an act she hadn't measured to its end. "Do you think you've fixed anything?" she whispered. "Do you think this will make it right?" I had no answer that would satisfy anything other than a legal brief. I said, "I wanted you to understand. I wanted accountability." She shook her head slowly, reached for the salt shaker, and then withdrew her hand. We ate our pasta in silence. The room felt like an old play where neither of us wanted to remember our lines. The danger escalated again when a thin piece of information reached me via an intermediary. Mason Keene had resources and an appetite for discretion. He also had a network of people used to making inconvenient questions disappear. He was not someone who liked the noise of reporters poking at his friends. The implicit threat was clear: damage could be contained if traded, and someone like Keene's people would prefer a trade over a spectacle. That evening, after I hung up with Claire and left the bureau, I found my apartment door ajar. It was a small thing, no smashed glass, no sign of an intruder beyond the slight tilt of the deadbolt, but the space felt violated in a way the absence of items cannot quantify. Someone had come in, moved a coaster an inch to the left, left a snare on the counter where my coffee had sat. It was a message: "We can be here." There are moments in any escalation where the cost calculation flips. you begin to see the true risk, not of being proven wrong, but of being made to disappear in small ways, stressed until you look like a man in morgue, pushed into choices that make you vulnerable, or worse, targeted in ways that don't show up in headlines. Claire offered me witness protection on paper. In practice, the Bureau's hands were tied. They could secure you for a time, give you resources and warnings, request subpoenas and notices, but they could not stop private actors from whispering into the right ears. Keep your profile low, she said. Keep your copies redundant. Don't be alone. The advice was sensible, but it felt like telling a man not to breathe in a world that already suffocated him. I began to watch for the ways people disappeared. A contractor who didn't return calls, a journalist who suddenly lost interest, a bank that started asking procedural questions about my client work. The campaign to silence is not always physical. Sometimes it's a soft erosion of credibility. That the powerful can make you look unstable or obsessive. They can take the moral high ground. They can recast the story into one of a jilted man who overreached. The press loves that narrative. People love a tidy villain. So I prepared another layer of redundancy. Copies of ledgers and emails went to offshore secure accounts. I gave another dossier to the journalist with explicit conditions. Publish if anything happens to me, or if the case disappears under suspicious circumstances. I told my sister only that I might need help, nothing more. So there would be a person who could verify if I was suddenly unreachable. There is a small human comfort in dragging one other soul into your contingency. One night, after I'd set those arrangements, a man I later learned was a private investigator showed up at my office building. He had the patient friendliness of someone who does unpleasant work and calls it research. He asked a few rhetorical questions about my work and then leaned in with the blunt candor of someone offering a bargain. "You can stop this," he said softly. "You let the big folks protect themselves, and we can make sure the Bureau doesn't leak anything unsavory about you. We can make this go away." The offer was dirty with implication. It assumed both that I had a price and that there were people willing to negotiate my silence. I told him no. Saying no is a lesser act of courage than holding a gun, but it leaves your body open. The man left, his smile professional. I watched him go and felt the city press at the windows like a hand. That night I slept badly. If sleep it was, dreaming of ledger lines collapsing into one another, like dominoes, but with the knowledge that some dominoes are built with steel and do not topple easily. When I awoke, my phone chimed with a single, anonymous message. "You've done a lot of damage, Daniel. Choose your next move carefully." M. The initial felt like a signature and a warning. The investigation was no longer an abstract affair. It had become a duel, and someone had already decided they would not lose quietly. The next day Claire called and said, quietly, "We have a protected witness who says they have more documents tying Hillsborough to a conduit account used in the Blue Wave transactions. If their evidence checks out, Mason Keene could be subpoenaed. But be careful. You're in line for pressure, legal, financial, and other." The sentence hung at the end like a threat and a benediction. She didn't need to finish it. I had heard the shape of it before. I stepped back into the rain that afternoon and felt the city press against me. The architecture of my plan had done what it was designed to do, expose a network that had been quiet for too long. But now the network was turning, and it had claws. The brilliant clarity I'd felt at the hotel months ago had been replaced by a new certainty. There is a cost to illumination, and it is often paid in small, exacting measures. Something else had shifted too. A quieter terror that had nothing to do with subpoenas or threats. I was losing the line between being a man who sought justice and a man who took pleasure in other people's ruin. That blur is the dangerous place. It's where people excuse cruelty in the name of balance. I swore I would not cross it, but the nights were long, and the steps I'd taken had their own momentum. Claire asked me one last question before the meeting adjourned. "Are you prepared for what happens if Keene comes after you in a way that doesn't involve law?" She didn't have to elaborate. The implication was vivid. I looked at her and said, honestly, I don't know. She didn't smile, because there was nothing funny about it. Then make sure everything you touch is traceable in a way that protects others if something happens to you, she said. Don't be a lone point of failure. It was practical advice, but it sounded like mourning. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the photograph of Sophie and Ethan open on my laptop, and the ledger files spread around like a map. I thought about the man who'd first handed me his heart, and then used it as a terrain on which to walk someone else. I thought about the journalist who promised to publish if I disappeared. I thought about Claire Jennings and her careful eyes. Outside, a car door slammed. A block away, someone laughed a sound brittle as glass. My phone vibrated again with another anonymous message, shorter this time. We're patient. So should you be. And I closed the laptop. The files were encrypted in 6 places and copied in 3. A Deadman trigger lay waiting in an account a reporter would access if a signal word was not sent. I had done what I could to make the story indelible. The rest would be up to the tide of the city and the reckoning of men who prefer to live in shadows. I thought briefly of going to the police and asking for more protection. I thought of dropping everything, deleting the files, and trying to live in the small, quiet life I had once inhabited. But the ledger is a stubborn thing. Once it's exposed, you cannot simply stroke it back into anonymity. There was a knock at the door. It was not a polite knock. It was the kind that suggests someone who expects an answer. My heart picked up, not from fear this time, but with that older, pure adrenaline focus. I opened the door. A woman stood on the stoop. Her hair was clipped short, her face set in the tired, efficient lines of someone who had been awake too many nights. She held a thin envelope and did not smile. Daniel Mercer, she asked. Yes. She handed me the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, a photograph of a donor list, a scanned bank transfer, a note in black ink. We have confirmation. Be at Pier 9 at midnight. Come alone. C. The scene, not Claire. I realized with an odd lurch was an initial I did not recognize. I had thought the network had one axis. It had turned out to be a lattice. Allies could be allies. Enemies could masquerade as intermediaries. The game had grown complex enough to frighten me, but not so complex that I would walk away. I folded the photograph, slid it into my pocket, and felt the weight of the paper like a compass. Midnight at Pier 9, come alone. The next move would determine more than one fate. The quiet had become a battlefield, not cinematic, but intimate and precise, and I had to choose whether to go out into the dark or barricade myself until the storm passed. I took a breath and began to walk. The walk to Pier 9 felt longer than it was. Rain had turned the city to glass and oil. Every street lamp threw a halo that blurred edges and made faces anonymous. I kept my collar up and my hands in my pockets, the photograph folded into a small square against my thigh like a compass I couldn't read. Midnight came and went as a soft punctuation. The pier waited, a strip of wood and iron cutting into dark water that smelled of salt and old engines. When I arrived, the pier was nearly empty. A single lamp burned at the far end, staining the slats with a weak yellow. The water below looked like spilled ink. My breath steamed in the air and felt loud. I walked to that lamp, my shoes making a hollow sound on wet wood, and scanned for silhouettes. She was there before I saw her properly, a woman wrapped in a long coat, hands in gloves, hood pulled up. She looked small against the scale of the pier, like someone trying to keep warm in a room that had lost its heat. When she turned, I recognized the set of her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes, and I felt something like relief and apprehension at once. Daniel, she said. The name came out flat. Practiced. Are you C? I asked because I had to make sense of initials in a city that loved anonymity. She nodded. Cass. Cassidy Lane. I work with Marlowe. The name landed like an anchor. Marlowe, the journalist who'd taken the first tentative piece and nudged it into a national story, was someone I'd trusted to keep my Deadman trigger safe. Marlowe sent me. Claire vetted me. She glanced at the envelope in my hand. I'm sorry. This had to be fragile. Why not Claire? I asked. The Bureau's Claire had been efficient and careful. The idea of her sending a private emissary felt like a breach of the bureaucratic contract I thought we were under. Because Claire can't be here. Cass folded her hands together, knuckles showing. She has other pressures, legal constraints. The Bureau doesn't move like a newsroom. I can move. She looked at me then, like she was trying to inventory my face for the ways it had hardened since the W Hotel. You did good, Daniel. You found a thread. You pulled. It was messy but necessary. Now the problem is bigger than one firm. It's institutional. I wanted to ask whether she had come with offers or threats, but the peer had a way of making everything sound like a confession. So, what do you have? Cass reached into her coat and slid a small flash drive across the wood. It gleamed with cheap plastic, like a relic of a simpler time. Bank records, she said. Transfers. A pattern we can trace to Keen's shell accounts. Enough to get a subpoena if Claire wants it. But there's more. She hesitated, then added, we also have somebody on the inside who's willing to testify, with documentation. The word testify is heavier at midnight. It felt like a gavel. I thought of David, thin and trembling at the pier weeks ago, of Sophie handing over her laptop, of the bureaus and banks and motions. The map had become a web that might strangle or save, depending on who tugged which strand. Who? I asked. Cass's face tightened. A controller at Hillsborough. Name's Peter, mid-level, brew a conscience. He's terrified, but he's provided scanned ledgers showing consolidation into Keen-linked accounts. He wants assurance, witness protection, guarantees, things the Bureau might be able to offer but that private parties like Marlowe can also leverage by making publication immediate if something goes wrong. Publication as protection. The logic made sense. The louder we made the story, the harder it would be to bury. But loudness invites blows too. I thought of the message from the anonymous envelopes, the man in the lobby. Power prefers silence. Why come to me? I asked. Why not go straight to Claire with the ledger and the testimony? Because Claire needed someone to make sure you were willing to go public if things escalated. Cass said bluntly, there are people who can make an investigation stall with legal maneuvers and phone calls. Claire can subpoena, but she can't control the press cycle. Marlowe can. He wants to know you'll stand with him if the Bureau gets backed into a corner. He wants to know you won't sign away the dossier for a pardon. It was an ugly calculus. Protection from the law versus public exposure. I felt the old nausea at the center of trade-offs. And what does Marlowe want in return? Truth, Cass said, with a quickness that suggested the word had been measured for its moral tact. He wants the whole thing, no editing that leaves out the names of who profited. He wants Reed Keen, whoever on paper. I thought of Mason Keen in his tailored suits, moving money like a man rearranges furniture. I thought of the envelope, the photograph of donor lists and transfers, the nights I had spent encrypting and copying and making traces indelible. I thought of Sophie Small and trembling at an Italian restaurant end of the line I told myself I wouldn't cross. Bringing Keen into a headline would upend his world. And in doing so, it would guarantee retaliation. Give me what you have, I said. And for once my voice sounded steady. Cass hesitated, and then handed me the drive. We uploaded a copy to a secure server, she said. Claire has a hash. Marlowe has a backup. Peter's testimony is recorded, but he wants to meet with investigators in person, under condition of protection. The Bureau wants him. But if the Bureau is forced to stall, Marlowe will go public. And I asked, is he still breathing down my neck? Cass's mouth tightened. Has always been watching. Mason Keen doesn't send threats unless he wants you to get the message. He owns influence and legal teams. He's protective of his network. If he thinks the leak was engineered, he will retaliate. The question is, does he retaliate quietly or loudly? You want him to choose quietly for my sake. I thought of the unmarked sedan, the man who'd left the glossy envelope with the legal seal on my stoop. I thought of my apartment door slightly ajar. I thought of the private investigator who'd offered to make the problem go away. The city that smelled of rain felt suddenly like a map of possible exits and no safe routes. Why us? I asked. Why the fuss? You could hand this to Claire with or without me. Cass squinted. Because you pulled the thread. Because you made yourself vulnerable in the first place. You could walk away and sleep easy if you weren't the one who made it public. But you didn't walk away. You chose to build a truth. If Claire can prosecute cleanly, good. If the legal system is compromised by influence, we publish and make it impossible to sweep. That requires you to be willing to be loved. I pictured headlines: my name, the photograph, the dossier, the words embezzlement, political donor, influence peddling. The thought of being the center of a story terrified me in a new way. Not because I feared legal consequences, my cooperation with the Bureau bought me some cover, but because sometimes people respond to being named in ways the law can't. Police, you want me to be your public face? I asked, and in the way the words came out I saw their weight. Cass's answer was a shrug with no humor. We want you to be willing to stand behind the documents in public if the Bureau is obstructed. We want Marlowe to know you won't fold if he runs the story simultaneously. That's leverage. The Bureau can protect a witness, but they can't control a news cycle. You controlling the narrative makes it harder for Keene to make problems disappear. I exhaled. The night air tasted of salt and old engines and fear. If I agree, what then? Cass's eyes were kind of map. Then we give Claire the ledger. She issues stronger subpoenas. Peter is interviewed under protection. If Keene or his counsel pulls legal stunts to bury it, Marlowe runs the story. If anyone tries to silence the Bureau or witnesses, the story hits everything: donor lists, board memberships, transfers. It becomes dangerous for them to make it go away, dangerous for them, dangerous for me. The rub was clear. I thought of Sophie's face, the way she'd once been my reason. I thought of the man who had kissed her under the rain, and of the ledger that had exposed the reach of the rot. I thought of the envelope and the man in the lobby, of the private investigator's offer. I thought of the Deadman trigger and the journalist's readiness to publish. Tell Claire I'll cooperate, I said finally. But on one condition. Double quotes. Cass cocked her head. Which is that Marlowe runs his full piece only if Claire confirms the subpoenas and Peter's statements are secure. No premature leaks. We move in lockstep. Bureau, witness, press. If the Bureau is compromised, we go loud. But I won't be used to bait a story if Claire isn't protecting the witness. Cass smiled then, a small, tired thing. Fair. That's what she wanted to hear in a roundabout way. We stood there under the lamp, to figures, and the dark water between us. It felt like an armistice. It felt like a truce. It also felt perilous, an arrangement between a man in a bureau with legal tools and a journalist hungry for a scoop. I stuffed the drive into my jacket and felt its weight like a second heartbeat. Be careful, Cass said, and in her voice there was no bureaucratic softness, just plain warning. You too, I said, which felt like an inadequate blessing. She turned then, put up, and walked back toward the city. I watched her go until the light swallowed her silhouette. When she was gone, the pier seemed lonelier than before. On the walk back I called Claire. She answered on the third ring, her voice brisk. You met Cass? Yes. I told her everything: the drive, Peter, the conditions. I kept nothing out. The bureau's walls were high. I had to maintain a clear ledger with them. Good, she said into the phone. We'll move. Peter's testimony will need verification. We'll handle witness protection if he cooperates. Do not under any circumstances go public before we've had a chance to secure the documents. And the witness. I understand. I did. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. The word felt like a promise to a future I didn't yet own. After I hung up, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because there was a plan that might break the rock. Heavier because the plan involved me in a way I couldn't detach from without losing whatever moral ground I had convinced myself I'd kept. At home, I placed the flash drive in my safe, double encrypted its contents, and made 3 offline backups. I deleted the email traces, burned cookies, and set alerts for any probe into my accounts. The city hummed outside my window, drivers, late shift workers, the distant sound of a bar closing. I lay awake and thought of the man who'd sent the messages, and of all the polite threats that had cluttered my life in recent weeks. At about 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A single message lit the screen. "We're watching, be careful who you trust." This time, the message had an undertone that felt less like a warning and more like a promise of escalation. I stared at the words for a long time, then slipped the phone under my pillow and tried to sleep. Sleep came in thin, fitful slices. I woke to a phone call from Claire at 9 a.m. "Peter's in," she said. "He's under protection. He gave us the ledger and a contact list. We have enough to get a grand jury subpoena if we need one. We'll move today." Relief was a quick, shocking thing. I felt it like a cough. Then Claire added, quietly but expect pressure. "King's counsel is already filing motions. They're prepping public statements. This is going to be loud." I swallowed. Loud meant headlines, meant cameras, meant people I didn't trust looking for leverage. Loud also meant less likelihood of quiet deals made behind closed doors. "Then let Marlowe know we'll proceed," I said. "He can prep, but he waits for your signal." "I'll tell him," Claire said. "And Daniel, be careful who you meet today. And don't go anywhere alone tonight." We hung up. The day unrolled in a flurry of motion. Claire's office working the subpoenas, Marlowe drafting queries, Cass relaying small logistics. By afternoon, Peter's testimony had been recorded under grant of conditional protection. The Bureau moved with a bureaucratic grace: legal forms, transcripts, sealed evidence. The grand jury, if called, would have enough to compel testimony and production of documents from several banks. And yet, under all this motion, I felt a new, colder current, the knowledge that Mason Keene would not surrender without trying to hurt the people who threatened him. The network would lash back. It would be subtle or vicious, depending on which corner he preferred to fight from. At 6:12 p.m., as the sun began to make the glass towers look like slabs of dying gold, my phone lit again. This time the message was a photo, a grainy image of my sister leaving a grocery store near her apartment. Below it a line, "We can be delicate if you are." Then the name was a clean, clinical hammer. I stared at the picture until the pixels blurred. The cost of exposure was no longer theoretical. It had shifted into personal, close, brutal. Ledger, the drive, the witness, the bureau, all of it had become a chessboard where the opposing pieces were people who did not hesitate. I placed the phone face down on the table. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The city outside pulsed as if nothing had changed, but the rules had altered. This fight was no longer one I could keep strictly professional. It had reached the edges of the only life I still held dear. I made coffee and then called Marlowe. "Ready on our end," he said, "but we wait for the Bureau's signal." "Tell Cass to keep Peter safe," I said. "And tell Claire I'll do whatever she needs." "Good," Marlowe said. "And Daniel, if it turns loud, remember this. Truth is a torch. It can burn you and everyone around you if you don't handle it right." I hung up and looked out at the lake. The surface was contraceptive, as always. I thought of how many people sat at their own breakfast tables that morning with no idea the world was about to tilt. I thought of Sophie working through her legal team, of David somewhere waiting for his fate, of Mason Keene watching the ripples he had set into motion. The next morning, Claire texted the word that meant we moved in alignment. Now, Marlowe's piece dropped at 8 a.m. Clean, hard, and merciless. It named Hillsborough Holdings, showed screenshots of transfers, and cited Peter's testimony. It put Mason Keene into a public orbit he could not easily step out of. By 9 the live feeds were on, the city's legal salons buzzing, the bureau's phones ringing off the hook with tips. The shock of seeing it in print was almost physical. My name appeared not as the protagonist, but as the source, a close industry observer. The phrasing was careful, protective. Cass had arranged it that way. Claire had cleared the legal edges. The story hit hard, and the world started to rearrange. Within hours, Mason Keene's counsel issued a terse statement calling the allegations unfounded and politically motivated. Keene's philanthropy team released glossy photos of his gala dinners and lists of beneficiaries. The counter-movement had begun. The network was not idle. The phone at my side rang continuously with unknown numbers and thinly veiled threats. An unmarked car idled outside my sister's apartment for a half hour and then left. Someone had sent a bouquet to her office with a polite note, "Best wishes." She called, voice tight, and asked me if I was safe. I said I was, and we both knew the lie. By that evening, men in suits I'd never met came to the bureau with glossy letters and arguments about defamation and reputational harm. Keene's lawyers filed for emergency consideration. The law moved at the speed of formal prose, but the world had already read the story. The pressure increased. The reprisals would be subtler now. Audits of my clients, social ructions, thin articles that suggested I'd overreached to settle a private vendetta. And in the midst of it, Claire called with a single sentence that felt like a verdict and a benediction. "They tried to intimidate Peter this morning. He's frightened, but he stood. He refused to be bought." For 1 6-second, relief and terror collided. Relief that the witness had held, terror that Keene's network was now actively moving their pieces into place. The fight had widened into a battlefield none of us had asked for, but one that, once lit, would not be easily extinguished. I thought, in that thin highway men do when they are deciding whether to be brave or reckless. About the last move before checkmate. The ledger had been exposed, the net had shown its claws. The city had watched. And somewhere in the shifting noise, Mason Keene gathered his counsel and decided whether he would fight in court or in shadows. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark an instant longer, and then began to prepare for whatever shape that fight would take. They say every plan, no matter how intricate, eventually burns. I used to believe that was poetic exaggeration. Now I know it's physics. Pressure builds, and when enough heat collects behind a wall of lies, the wall gives. 3 days after the Chronicle ran Marlowe's story, Seattle woke to a city that had changed shape. Mason Keene's empire began to fracture in real time. Stock freezes, silent resignations, board members giving statements that sounded like prayers disguised as denials. His face, that polished image of philanthropy and power, was everywhere. On screens, in cafes, in news bulletins, in the digital static between every conversation. But the thing about men like Keene is, they never fall alone. They drag everything tethered to them into the fire. The first to vanish was Cass. Her number went dead 2 nights after the expose. Marlowe couldn't reach her, and Claire's office claimed she was relocated for safety. But when I checked the internal bureau message relay, her ID was marked inactive. No exit record, no transfer request, just gone, erased in a way that smelled of something more deliberate than protection. Then Peter, the witness. He'd been under bureau watch at a safe apartment downtown. Claire called me at 4:27 a.m., voice stripped of sleep and emotion. "Peter's gone," she said. "No forced entry. Cameras disabled. He left through the back alley wearing a maintenance uniform. We found the guard unconscious. He's not on any transport logs." My stomach turned cold. Gone or taken? A pause that lasted too long. "We don't know yet," Claire said quietly, "but I knew." We both did. That morning, I drove. Nowhere in particular, just away from the idea of stillness. The city had the color of gunmetal. Clouds hung low like a threat. Every billboard with Keen's name felt like a ghost blinking in denial. My phone buzzed once. Unknown number. A text, "You built this. Now live in it." I stopped at a red light and stared at the words until the car behind me honked. I didn't reply. Some conversations don't deserve oxygen. Instead, I went home and began making backups of my backups. Physical drives, encrypted, hidden in places only paranoia could justify. Every noise outside my apartment sounded like a prelude. Every silence felt earned. By evening, Marlowe sent me an encrypted message. "They're pushing counter-narratives. Fabricated bank records to muddy the case. You'll see attacks. Brace yourself." He wasn't exaggerating. By midnight, anonymous posts appeared on forums accusing me of data manipulation, screenshots of emails I'd never written, suggesting my motives were financial. The speed and precision of the smear was surgical. I'd underestimated the reach of Keen's machine. The next morning, my office at Nexitech was temporarily suspended pending investigation. HR avoided my eyes when they handed me the letter. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just tired. Anger burns fast. Exhaustion lingers like radiation. That night, Claire came to see me. She stood in my doorway, drenched from rain, a figure of control unraveling at the edges. "They're going to bury it," she said. "Without Peter's testimony, the grand jury stalls. The transfers alone aren't enough. Keen's lawyers are dismantling our evidence piece by piece. Someone inside the bureau is leaking procedures." "Then leak it all," I said. "Marlowe can make it nuclear." She shook her head. "If we do that, people get hurt. Names not even tied to Keen's staff. Interns, families. He's built a maze of shell accounts that loop through charities and pension funds. You burn it all, you burn innocence too." For a long time the only sound was the rain. Then she said quietly, "You could disappear. You've done enough. You exposed the rot. Let the system clean the rest." "The system?" I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The system is his playground, Claire. You know that." She didn't argue. She just looked at me with something like pity. "Then what are you going to do?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. 2 nights later, I became a ghost in my own story. I reactivated the Deadman trigger, the one Marlowe and I had designed as a safeguard. Except this time, I rewired it. I split the upload into 4 fragments, stored across servers in Iceland, Canada, Singapore, and a university database disguised as astronomy research data. Each fragment contained proof not just of Keen's transfers, but of his countermeasures, the falsified ledgers, the payments to security firms, the private investigators, and one horrifying thread that linked him directly to a senator's re-election fund. If I died or disappeared, the fragments would merge, decrypt, and go public automatically. It wasn't heroism. It was insurance. At 3:11 a.m., I received another message from him. "Walk away, Daniel." "Last warning," I typed back. "I can't. It's already set." The reply came 20 seconds later. "Then you'll understand what happens next." It happened fast. Glass shattered somewhere below my floor. A hum of metal on concrete, like doors being forced. I grabbed the laptop, ran a last command to trigger the backup, and pulled the emergency drive from the dock. Then silence. Footsteps in the hallway, measured. Professional. I moved to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I kept the pepper spray, the old flashlight, and the revolver I'd never fired outside a range. My hands shook, but my mind was calm, that eerie, detached calm that happens when adrenaline meets inevitability. The door burst open. 2 men, black jackets, silent, no insignia. I aimed before I could think. One moved, too fast, and then everything folded into noise and flashes of light. When I woke, I was in a hospital bed. The smell of antiseptic, the soft beep of a monitor. Claire sat beside me, face pale, eyes bloodshot. "They found you in your apartment," she said softly. "You're lucky." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. "Marlowe?" "Alive," she said. "Cast 2. She resurfaced yesterday. She'd been moved by internal security after her comms were compromised. Peter's safe. We found him. Witness protection off-grid. I blinked at her, trying to make sense of it. Then Keen's under federal indictment. A pause. He tried to flee last night. His jet never left the runway. Marlowe's second expose hit minutes before that. The Bureau moved in. We have him for the first time in months. I exhaled without pain. Weeks later, the world quieted. Keen's empire collapsed in court and headlines. Executives turned state's witness. Money clawed back. Reputations in ruins. The press called it the digital purge. Claire was promoted. Marlowe wrote a book. Cass vanished again, probably under another name. As for me, I sold the apartment, moved south, near the coast. I fix old computers for small businesses now, the kind that still think passwords are optional. I walk by the ocean at dusk and try not to think about how vengeance can feel like victory and grief at the same time. Sometimes I still get messages. An unlisted number. A single line. You did well. See your once balance restored. And I never reply. Some ghosts deserve to fade quietly. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice and revenge share the same skeleton. The difference is what you choose to build on top of it, a weapon or a warning. I built both. And in the end, when the dust settled and the noise faded, I realized something. The real punishment isn't losing what you love. It's living long enough to understand why you destroyed it.